Namaskar, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on the time zone where this is being live streamed. Welcome to everybody, and a big thank you to Teamworks, to my friend Namita, who I have known from my undergrad days and reconnected in Boulder. So Boulder is very special. So we are here at this session today, which is called Walls and Bridges, the Immigrant Story. And we hope to take it from the works of fiction and other topical writing that our authors have done here to our current debates here in the US. So we hope that we will have both a creative expression of views here as well as of topical opinions on what is happening around us. I have with me Marcia Douglas in the middle. She is the author of novels Madam Fate, Notes from a Writer's Book of Cures and Spells, as well as a poetry collection. In addition to writing, she performs a one-woman show called Natural Her Story and is an associate professor at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Her novel, The Marvelous Equations of the Dread, is forthcoming in 2016. 17? 16? Yes, 2016. 16, all right. Andrew Lamb, at the far end, is a senior editor at New America Media and an author of 3 books: Perfume Dreams, Reflections on the Vietnamese Diaspora, East Eats West, Writing in Two Hemispheres. You know, that can be both amusing and rather tragic. Depends on how you dwell on that expression. And The Birds of Paradise Lost, an amazing collection of short stories that I had the pleasure of looking at the last 1 week. He's been a PEN Award winner and was a regular commentator on NPR's All Things Considered. Scott Haas, Dr. Scott Haas, to my left. I say doctor because there may be other doctors and PhDs, but this one is a clinical psychologist. So when people say, sometimes to me saying, you're a doctor, I'm like, I'm the other kind of doctor. Don't come up with a medical problem. So, but here you can. No, I won't, but others will. Scott Haas is a writer and clinical psychologist based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He is the author of Hearing Voices, Reflections of a Psychology Intern, Are We There Yet? And Back of the House. He's the co-author of Da Silvano. He also writes on travel and leisure. He won a James Beard Award for his on-air broadcast on Here and Now, a nationally syndicated show on NPR. He also works at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center, a Harvard Medical School teaching hospital. He's at work now on a book about grief and resiliency in families. And you don't want to be consulted?
Not medically.
Okay. So it's about his new book called Those Immigrants that we have him here on this panel especially. And he and I will be in another session tomorrow talking only about that book. And then I have Tim Hernandez, an award-winning poet, novelist, and performer. He's a recipient of the American Book Award for Poetry, the Colorado Book Award for Poetry, and the International Latino Book Award for Historical Fiction. His books and research have been featured in the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, CNN, Public Radio International, and so on. He holds a BA from Naropa University, right here, and an MFA from Bennington College. He's currently assistant professor at the University of Texas in creative writing. Last but not least is Suketu Mehta, New York-based author, best known for now until his next big bestseller comes in. Best known now for his book called Maximum City, Bombay Lost and Found, which won the Kriyama Prize and was a finalist for the 2005 Pulitzer Prize. Mehta is an associate professor of journalism at NYU, and he is currently working on a nonfiction book about immigrants in contemporary New York, for which he's been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, and we are eagerly waiting for that book to arrive. Our session today, and I should introduce myself. I'm Maina Singh. I teach at the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. I'm from India, and I teach about South Asia and India to students who are going into foreign service and into policy making. I teach them about identity, about diaspora, about society, so that they may make better policies in the future. I also teach a course called Global Indians, which looks at Indian diaspora communities spread across all the continents and ranging from the colonial period and descendants of the indentured labor all the way to the new labor diaspora in West Asia and the Gulf countries. So Indian Americans are of special interest to me, and that's a conversation that Dr. Scott Haas and I will have tomorrow. As Namita said this morning, that this is a space for conversations, not just in conversations about our lives, so not just in fiction, but our lives here and now. And we will frame our conversation today in the broader context of immigration to America. So a few general remarks. The American dream has smitten men and women from across the globe for the longest time. Immigrants arrive with dreams on boats, planes, taking risks of life, exhausting their savings. They come with and without education. And they all come with dreams. Some are realized beyond their expectations. Many turn into prolonged nightmares, economic, social, psychological, often taking the second generation to resolve them. I'm taking a sentence from Scott Haas's book called Those Immigrants. Quote, "It is a tough place, the States, where money matters more than many other places on earth, and where politically correct talk can insidiously mask injustice." This is the context of the first part of our discussion. In the second part, we will pose some more difficult questions regarding the anti-immigrant rhetoric in many parts of America this fall. And we will explore what our panelists have to say, not just about the bridges necessary for a multicultural society to function, but also the walls that are being talked about and the walls that are being threatened to be built, developing a fortress mentality to keep outsiders out. So I'm going to begin with the first part of our discussion. My question to all of you is in the following context. Writing immigrant experiences, I believe, can be an exercise in several different things: reconstructing memory, bringing visibility to lost narratives. It can be a celebration of survival and resilience, and it can also be revisiting tragedies that got brushed away by subsequent histories. And I'm posing a generic question to each one of my panelists, which they will respond to in about 3 or 4 minutes and highlight the work that they wish to. Which of these or any other aspect best characterizes your work? Please refer to specific books so people know what to buy. And I'm going to start with Andrew, and then we'll go down this way.
Good morning or good afternoon, I can't tell. Thank you for attending, and it's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Vietnamese experience in America. It's a little bit different than what you would typically understand as an immigrant experience, because to me, an immigrant is someone who plans ahead, sells his house, and then say goodbye to the neighbors and give away the dog or whatever it is, and then buy a ticket to America. Vietnamese American have a little bit different experience in the sense that we initially were exposed, forced out of Vietnam. And so the refugee experience is a little bit different because many of us didn't have an American dream so much as we had to flee from war and a place in which no longer tolerate our presence. And so our exodus really started from a point of trauma. And so it is what I write in all 3 books, is that experience and exploration, what it means to be exiled and then slowly find your way and your place in the new world. And that in itself is a little bit different than your typical, oh, I want to make it in America. To be honest, when I was a child, my imagination of America was reduced to this one image of a poster that my cousin, who did live in America, came back with, which is of a ice cream cone with 32 or 31 flavor that kind of impossibly, the scoops are like on top of each other. And in Vietnam, all we had was chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. And to me, America was this this paradise in which ice cream cone can hold up all this flavor without falling. And that was the bulk of my imagine of America at that point. So for me who came into America at that young age of 10 or 11, it was a shock, but it also a place in which everything changed and I changed and the world that I came from is gone. And there was no coming back during the Cold War, so there is this sense of you are stuck here. And for my parents, it was not going to a greater place, but to go from having status back home to living as paupers at the end of Mission Street, where San Francisco ended and Daly City began, and the working class poor that surrounded us. So that was the experience that I had in America initially. But then I think, and eventually, however, we began to fall in love with America. I fell in love with the English language, for instance. I didn't know why my voice shattered when I spoke English. Of course, no one told me about puberty or the birds and the bees. And so then, my older brother said, your mom told you not to speak English in a house, and here you are speaking it so much that your voice shattered. That's why you speak like a duck. And then it was odd because I spoke French in Vietnam and didn't do a thing. And in America, English entered me and things were changing. And, everything seems to be different and these whiskers had to grow. And then, so in a weird way, I fell in love with America the way I fell in love with the English language. It was truly magical. And so it's all these things I talk about, all these things I address in this trauma plus transformation that are in the kind of work that I do.
Thank you. Tim, was yours similar, different?
I think my work takes off where you mentioned, I think, something about reclaiming lost narratives. Right. I think of the Nigerian authors, her name is Chimamanda Adichie. She has a wonderful TED Talks where she talks about the dangers of the single story or the single narrative. Obviously that is happening today, and we see the single narrative, especially around the idea or the concept or the word immigrant and other words that the media perpetuates and also politicians are perpetuating. But there is a dangerous, and we start to see now that manifested. There is a danger in the single narrative that is being told out there, that is being peddled to us. So I'm going to refer to one of the books that I wrote that started getting me involved in this idea of approaching and redressing these lost narratives is my book, Mañana Means Heaven, in which the American novelist Jack Kerouac wrote a book in 1957, On the Road. Most of us are familiar with On the Road. What most of us are not familiar with is that the book On the Road was rejected for 7 years until he published an excerpt from that, a 20-page excerpt titled The Mexican Girl, about a Mexican farm worker that he met in the San Joaquin Valley in California, where I'm from, where my family's from, where they themselves were migrant farm workers. Well, I started to explore that idea a little bit more. Who is that character? And because I recognized that not only did Kerouac get, for me, it was even more than the character herself, it was more the landscape that I knew. I was very aware of the historical, sort of the history, the historical context of that landscape, and there were things that he obviously had left out. It was fiction, so, that's what they do, fiction writers. They, not me. They. I'm a fiction writer also, so I know. But the landscape, I felt, well, there was some startling inaccuracies, things that were obviously left out in the 1940s in the San Joaquin Valley. There was a mass repatriation going on. They were quite literally putting, 600,000 Mexicans into trains and deporting them back to Mexico, whether or not that 60% of them were actually U.S.-born citizens. So these are the kind of contextual things that Kerouac left out. And on top of that, of course, now B. Franco, this woman he's referred to as the Mexican girl. I didn't know when I started this research that I would actually find her alive. And she was still alive at the age of 92. And she actually happened to be living 1.5 miles down the street from my house. And I had gone to New York back and forth twice looking for evidence and trying to find her, and she lived 1.5 miles down the street from my house in Fresno at the time. So I interviewed her, and one of the first questions I asked her was, did you know that you were called the Mexican girl? That you have this legacy of the Mexican girl? And she said, oh, honey, I'm not Mexican. I was born in Los Angeles. So instantly I knew I had a counter narrative that I was going to be working on here, and that's what became of Mañana Means Heaven. And then I'm going to talk a little bit maybe also about what led me from Mañana Means Heaven to leap into this book that'll come out in January, which is called All They Will Call You, which is based on a popular song that Woody Guthrie wrote and a man named Martin Hoffman turned into music. It's a song called Plane Wreck at Los Gatos, Deportee, in which what happened was in 1948, the immigration had chartered a DC-3 deporting 28 Mexicans from Oakland back to Mexico, and the plane crashed down in California, killed everybody, and the media only wrote the names of the pilot, the immigration officer, the stewardess, and 28 deportees is what they called them. So in Woody Guthrie's song, he attempts to sort of restore the dignity by providing their names back. So for the last 6 years, my research has been to recover who those families were, their stories, and to write out the real lives of the people behind that song. So, yeah.
Very powerful, yes. You're speaking about erasures that are retrieved from things that exist but just don't get recorded.
That's right,
Yes.
yeah.
Marcia, does your work relate to these issues of space, reclaiming the space, reclaiming erasures?
Yes, definitely. My story is that I was born in the UK to Jamaican parents, and then we left to go to Jamaica when I was 6 years old. So I grew up in Jamaica. Jamaica is a place which has most formed me. It's where I get my sense of identity from. I came to the US when I was 19 years old, and I would say that, like Andrew, I didn't really come here with an American dream as such, because my parents sent me here, and here I was. I was also an undocumented immigrant for a number of years, and that's a story in and of itself. So I was here as an undocumented immigrant, and I decided that I was going to survive, and I did. And this is the experience which informs my fiction. My first novel, Madame Fate, tells the story of a Jamaican woman who leaves her daughter in Jamaica, and she goes to New York, and she has a very difficult time there. But what she's able to do is support her daughter who's left behind, and her daughter becomes, what you call a barrel child. Every so often, a barrel will come for you with clothes and food. And so I explore that story, and her daughter's left in Jamaica and hopes that she will be sent for, but she never is. My second novel, Notes from a Writer's Book of Cures and Spells, also has a family dispersed by immigration. There are 3 children. 2 are left behind in Jamaica. The parents pass away. The older sister goes to the U.S. and also struggles to communicate with her family back home. And what I find in my work is that, even if I don't set out to write about the experience of the immigrant as such, it just comes up anyway. In my book, which is coming out next month, The Marvelous Equations of the Dread, most of that book takes place in Jamaica, actually, in Kingston. However, I do have a character, Lena, who leaves the island to go to London. And she also has some challenges there. And another thing I would say which characterizes my work is that many of my characters end up either returning to the island or yearning to return. And that's interesting too, I think, now that I think about my work as a whole and the body of work.
Thank you. Your remarks are connecting with other threads that have either been expressed or lie subtextually in what has just been said. For instance, the myth of return is one of the concepts that is talked about in diaspora studies, which is that first-generation immigrants keep talking about, I'm just here to make the money, I'm going back. I don't mean the refugees, but I'm going back. Yeah. And this back doesn't happen, and the kids grow up hearing about this going back, and the kids have no interest in going back most of the time. And the idea of the homeland, and also the imaginary homelands, the concept that has been, that has now become a current concept that everybody talks about. I'd love for you to continue that, Suketu, and see if you find parallels or divergences with our conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me here. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I think it's
okay.
working.
Yeah, I'd love to immigrate to Boulder. But I'm from New York, so I don't know if my papers are valid. I came from Bombay to Jackson Heights in New York when I was 14, against my will. My parents brought me there kicking and screaming along with my 2 younger sisters. And when I got to Jackson Heights, I found myself in a building full of Indians and Pakistanis, Haitians and Dominicans, Jews and Muslims. The building had a Greek super, but was owned by a Turkish man. So these were all people who were killing each other just before they got on the plane. And here we were living next to each other, eating with each other. It's not that we stopped hating each other. We all said horribly racist things about everyone else when we were in our own apartments. But in the common areas of the building, the kids played together. And the one thing that united the building was Sunday mornings on a Spanish TV station called WNJU from Linden, New Jersey. There was a program called Vision of Asia, which was a Bollywood program. And the entire building, the Greeks, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Dominicans sang along to the Bollywood songs. And so I went from that building to a horribly racist Catholic school, an all-boys school, in which the teachers would call me a pagan. I was one of the first minorities. And I remember during the Iranian hostage crisis, there was me, and by that time, another Indian had come into the school. Or as was explained to me, hey, Mehta, there's not a Hindu in school. And my friend Ashish and I were walking down the halls, and this Irish kid comes up to us and says, fucking Ayatollahs. And I said, hey, we're not Iranians, we're Indians. He says, fucking Gandhis. So that's when I realized that there were people who didn't like me, and it didn't matter who I was. I could be Iranian, Indian, or Martian. I was just other. And that experience of going to that school, changing countries at the age of 14, which is a difficult age in which to change countries because you haven't finished growing up in one place and you're never well in your skin in the place you move to. So you're always going back and forth like a pendulum, which is what I've done. And I come from 3 generations of diamond merchants. I'm the only renegade. And so I decided the only way I could deal with this displacement was by becoming a writer. And so I started writing fiction. I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop. I'm a licensed fiction writer. And then I realized that wasn't going to pay the bills, so I went back to Bombay to see what had become to the city I'd left. And I wrote this book called Maximum City. I'm working on a book about New York. I've just come out with a short novella called What is Remembered, about an immigrant who goes to Jackson Heights to attempt to recover his mother's name, which is forgotten. And I'm also coming out with a short book about cities called The Secret Life of Cities, about which more tomorrow.
Fantastic. So you're ready to move into urban studies. Urban studies which speak about spaces without the people who are in them. And whose identities are so critical to the way spaces are shaped.
Well,
but
urban studies are about, architects talk about, it's about buildings talking to buildings, and I prefer talking about the people who are in the buildings.
Yes. Thank you. Your remarks about Jackson Heights made me think of the stories of the Indian Americans who started lives there and many of them were taxi drivers or whatever. And within a few years, they began to own those taxis and own many more. And I had gradually moved from there to Long Island and Nassau County and Greenwich and so on. And that's been their trajectory in the last 35 years. And it's a perfect segue into the work of Scott Haas, who's speaking about remarkable Indian Americans. Please.
So thank you all for inviting me here, and thank you for moderating the panel. I think many of the things that you said resonate for me, particularly the issue of resiliency. I think a lot of writers, thank you, I caught that. A lot of writers will tell you that when they start a book, they have something in mind, and as they progress through the book, what that book becomes more clear to them. And certainly when I started this book 5 years ago, I never would have imagined when it came out this May that I would be sitting here speaking about immigrants. The original idea of the book was to do with the fact that I live in Boston, and I was particularly intrigued by the hospitals where I work and the communities where I work. Each year I saw more and more people from India, and I became kind of intrigued, who are these individuals? And I was also kind of appalled by some of the stereotypes of so-called tiger mothers or genetic superiority, and I thought as a psychologist I would be able to try and find out a little bit more about what were some specific aspects within the Indian community that led to such high achievement in such a short period of time in so many different areas. Other immigrant groups that I knew growing up were the Jewish communities, the Chinese communities, the Korean communities where I grew up in Plainfield, New Jersey, and those communities established success in specific areas, but certainly not as quickly. But what changed too for me was it began to dawn on me as I was writing this book, and it wasn't until about 3 years ago after my parents died that I realized my father was a political refugee. He came to the United States from Germany, and actually very late in August of 1941 by himself. Everyone else was left behind and perished. But the point is that I realized there was some kind of personal motivation behind this, which leads to my point about resiliencies. So in the household I grew up, resiliencies were very important. And one of the books that I read that led to this book, Those Immigrants, was a book by another person who died, which is a psychiatrist named Stuart Hauser, who was a wonderful psychiatrist at the Judge Baker Clinic in Boston, which is attached to Children's Hospital. And he wrote this I thought a spectacular book called Out of the Woods. And it's about 100 teenagers who, against the odds, somehow achieved a lot. By achieved a lot, they survived. They survived substance problems, they survived disruption in the household, they survived difficulty at school. And he identified a number of factors that led to their success, and two of them appeared in the community that I'm writing about, and they appear in a lot of immigrant communities. And the first was not taking things personally. I mean, you talked about being hated in the school. So these kids, one of the kids said to Dr. Hauser, his mother had bought him a winter coat, and the father came home drunk and began yelling and hitting the mother, whatever. That coat is going back tomorrow. This is money we can't afford to spend. The kid's crying in his room. He realized the father is a loser, and it's not me. It's not me. It's Dad. Which leads to the second thing that Dr. Hauser found, which is a lot of people who are successful in terms of resiliencies, I don't mean successful financially or in the community, but just survive emotionally, have a mentor. It doesn't have to be somebody who says, you're the top of the class. It could be a coach saying, you know what, Mike, you were 15 minutes late, you let the team down, this happens again, I can't have you on the team. You're important to this team. Somebody who says to the kid, your dad, we're not going to talk about your dad. We're going to talk about your playing sports. My current clinical work, I work 3 mornings a week. I'm embedded in the largest welfare office in Massachusetts, and what I do there is I do state and federal disability evaluations for people applying for mental disabilities, and also I consult to the African Methodist Episcopal Church to determine if the ministers are mentally capable of leading flocks. I am the only person who appears to look like me in that building, and I'm very grateful to be there. And the reason I bring that up is because the resiliencies that I meet of individuals who are really, really trying hard to move forward is fairly spellbinding and inspiring. So I think the lessons of this book really bring forward remarkable success stories against the odds.
Thank you. I'm going to now move on to our next part of the discussion and to now root it. Thank you. and to now root it in our more current realities here in the US. So how do you think the current political conversations in the US this fall, how are these conversations generating anxieties among the immigrant communities that each one of you is familiar with? And what do you think small immigrant clusters living in the US can do socially and culturally to contain this rising tide of intolerance around them? So I'll just let anybody jump in. We have about 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll begin to wind down. So,
Well, I helped Al Jazeera put together a documentary. It's about 5 minutes long only, and one of them has to do with looking at boat people now versus boat people then, because Vietnamese boat people had experienced tremendous horror and tragedies trying to find freedom in the late 70s and early 80s. And yet we are watching the same boat people now escaping from Syria and similar areas to Europe, and the same kind of pushback efforts from Europe, the way that are happening now, the way Vietnamese were experiencing in Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on. And it's extraordinary to see how Vietnamese Americans watching this are being re-traumatized by their own experience, because many are first generation. And extraordinary to see them, like a story of Vietnamese in Canada sponsor 20 people, because he's a businessman now, and he said, I'm going to sponsor 20 refugees to come and help them resettle. Even though I know nothing about Syria, I know exactly what they are going through. So, while there is fear, there's great sympathy, because you see the repetition of history every decade or so.
So what about the communities who are here? Do you have any experience of how they're feeling today?
I mean, I think for me, I'm a big believer in just the sharing of stories. To combat the one story, the singular narrative. I worked for the California Council for the Humanities, part of the National Endowment for the Humanities for years. And one of the things we did, and I learned so much from this, was actually my job was to travel this sort of 400-mile radius of Central California and ask the different communities about what their stories were, what brought their families here. And in doing that, and one day I could be speaking to the North Fork Mono tribe who'd been there for since day one. And then I can, that afternoon, be speaking to a Khmer family down in Fresno, and then by that evening speaking to a Oaxacan family in Tulare. And that's one day, and I would suddenly learn that we actually, if we share our stories, we have much more in common than we do differences, and therefore I became a firm believer in the power of sharing the stories. And for us individually within any community, whether that community means a city like Boulder or it means just a neighborhood, the idea of getting to know your neighbor, sharing your own story and listening to their story, to me that's where the power is at.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the first part of your question, one thing I've noticed is in communities that I'm familiar with is that there seems to be a frenzy, I would say, to move towards citizenship, so that maybe some people who have green cards, who were content to remain that way, are now moving towards citizenship so that they can help others, I think. But I think also so that they can be a part of the democratic process as well and vote and have a voice. So I think that's one thing which is happening. And the second part of your question...
Just broadly that,
right.
What can they do, what are they feeling?
Right.
But, may I pick up on the word Democrat? Is that a pun on the word? Is like democratic process or Democrat process? Or is that automatic, that the immigrants and those on the path will go that way, will go blue?
Right, yeah. Well, it is a pun, I think, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
I would also add,
sorry, go ahead.
Quickly, that I would agree with Tim that, that we need more cultural bridges, and that the arts, definitely that's one of those bridges that can help us. Yeah.
So all of these three opinions are actually suggesting that the agency can be with the immigrant groups, is never mind that vicious political rhetoric. Do something here yourself with your neighbor, with your friend, with your colleague, with the kids who go to school with yours. Yeah. What do you think?
It's a very New York election. The three top candidates Trump, Clinton, and Sanders. They're from New York, or all of them. Clinton was the senator from New York. Her campaign headquarters in Brooklyn. Sanders, of course, was born in New York, so was Trump. I went to high school with guys like Donald Trump. He grew up in an all-white enclave called Jamaica Estates, which was then steadily being encroached upon by minorities like us. So the fear that he has in his being is this fear of a certain section of white New York, of white America, that feels that they're being besieged. And that's why he wants to sort of not just make America great again, but make America go back to some idealized version of Eisenhower America. So among Indians, there's a small but noisy section of Indian Americans who call themselves Hindus for Trump, and
Yes.
He's been invited to a Bollywood song and dance thing. And he doesn't like Indians, he makes fun of Indians, but these Indians like Trump because they share his antipathy towards Muslims. The majority of Indian Americans, though, still vote Democratic and will continue to do so in this election. But it's really, I think it's the most critical election of our lifetimes, not just for immigrants, but for residents. And I teach journalism, and I'm waiting for a journalist to turn to Donald Trump, this racist, misogynist bigot, and say to him, "Have you no decency left, sir? At long last, have you no sense of decency?" I think he needs to be confronted publicly like this, because what he stands for is everything that America does not stand for. That I've lived in Europe, and I've lived in Asia, I've lived in Latin America. This country still has that promise. We're all here. We don't get asked for our papers. There still isn't I was just on the Hungarian border, the Hungarian-Serbian border, and there's a giant fence that Orban has built. And so I went to this camp full of refugees on the other side. They were waiting at the gates of Fortress Europe with their children. And it really brought back really disturbing images of Nazi Europe. A razor wire fence, guards with dogs, drones, helicopters. Is this the future we want for the United States? It's the most critical election in the planet's history, because if we elect him, there goes not just the country, but the planet.
So if there are diverging opinions to what Suketu is saying, you may use the Q&A. I will defer to that. Dr. Scott Haas.
I was just going to say, I'm painfully optimistic. There's that New Yorker cartoon, and it shows Pollyanna in hell, and she's shouting, "No more winter coats." So that's kind of my outlook. I mean to say, the irony of Trump is that in the communities where I work, a lot of groups who were at odds with one another are, in fact, at least from what I'm able to observe, coming together a little bit more and saying we need to close ranks here, because we can't be divisive against one another faced with this kind of challenge. So I'm kind of hoping that maintains itself at least through the election.
Thank you. I'm now going to take the liberty of taking this conversation in the last few minutes to another really current development in the US, which is that campuses are really talking in very strong terms about racism on campus. Many campuses have students who are immigrants, students who are second generation or first generation US born. Many of them are doing really well. They could be Korean American, Chinese American, Indian American, what have you. There is a sense that many of those immigrants are actually not really plugging into the Black Lives Matter movement. I want to know from you, do immigrants really, is there a racism there as well? Are they not plugging in strongly enough into the Black Lives Matter? Is that something they're insulating themselves from? I'll just let anybody speak, and we have 5 or 6 minutes.
Well, I think so. I mean, there definitely is racism in every group, and racism against blacks has been very predominant in a lot of immigrant, especially newly arrived population, and that's not deniable. Even within my larger community and relatives and so on, there are people who speak ill of because of the black skin, and it takes a lot of confrontation. But it has to do with this lack of understanding of American history. They have no idea why blacks are here or anything else, and so their version of America is very simplified. I think for me, having gone through American education, reading work of Baldwin and so on, it's really allowed me to understand the plight and the historical context of where people are in our history. But for a lot of newly arrived immigrants, they only see certain angle of the story, and it takes a lot of explanation, and I don't think that kind of structure exists within the newly arrived communities.
So, Andrea, I'm really wondering, if people go to school and they study American history, they learn about all the wonderful achievements, wonderful aspects of American history, is there a selective amnesia there to say, I don't need to worry about this, I just get ahead? I mean, it's a tricky question. I mean, I'm happy to hear what other people have to say.
Other people might jump in, but I'll just say that there's a hypocrisy as well, like every group. But I know someone I won't name in my own community who loves football, loves basketball, have a big fan of certain black stars, and yet outside of that say really derisive things about the black community. And when I point that out, they never thought about it. It's just sort of that's the way they view. And they never really explore their own racism.
So is it time to start speaking about those things within immigrant communities, to reflect on their own marginalization and see that it's a broader current issue? What do you think?
I think, for me specifically, the university that I teach at is the University of Texas in El Paso. We're right on the border, and quite literally, we are on the border, across from Juarez, which is the sister city, which is, ironically, or not even ironically, just sort of shockingly, Juarez being on the top list of one of the top 5 most dangerous cities in the world, and El Paso actually being one of the top 5 most safest cities in the United States. What we've seen there, in terms of like the Black Lives Matter movement, is a solidarity on our campus, and it's exciting, and it's almost, because it's so exciting, and because I like to also look through the rosy lens of optimism. I think, and then there's this part of me that goes, something's brewing underneath that. I'm concerned about what that thing is. But for the most part, the students on our campus have mobilized around border issues, because they're, half of our students there are from Juarez. They actually make the trek every day across to come to school. But they've aligned themselves and had dialogues with the Black Lives Matter leaders in that community as well. So, that's exciting for us to see there, that there is an understanding of solidarity in these, and there is a connection between these two, seemingly disparate ideas, but yet very much under the, this single, student of color or person of color in the United States, and they see that. So for us, it's exciting to see that on our campus. I think that though they identify for them, and I see the dialogues are continuing to happen there. So it's a good thing there. I think that I think I'd like to just sort of offer that as a kind of little glimpse of optimism of what's going on in terms of these communities.
Right. Marcia, is there a difference that people see themselves of Jamaican origin as different from other people of African American origin? Are they willing to create solidarities comfortably?
I don't want to make any blanket statements, but sometimes it is that way. I think it's natural for immigrant groups. Sometimes they see themselves as necessarily a bit different or separate. And you mentioned campuses, and I'm thinking about what Andrew said about reading James Baldwin. And I would just like to, this is a literature festival. Want to end on the note of the power of books to create dialogue. One of the classes I teach at CU is on contemporary Caribbean literature, and it's always interesting to me how much of an impact that course, can have just because people are being exposed to
Sure.
a culture that they had, they had certain assumptions, and suddenly they realize what the Caribbean is really all about. And I think that for us as writers, that's something of, it's our function, and I think it's the way in which we can make a difference.
Thank you. I totally agree with that. Yes, Suketu?
So I'd like to talk about.
I think your mic went off.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd like to talk about one of the educational institutions that I got to know quite well, not NYU where I teach, but the New York Police Academy, where I was embedded for a whole class a couple of years ago. I saw a group of over 900 very diverse recruits. The majority of them were minorities. I watched them through a whole class training because I wanted to see this tension. The Black Lives Matter movement was just emerging then with the Garner shootings and so forth. So I got to know all these cops quite well as they went from the journey from being recruits to cops to see if they were really racists. And I remember the graduation ceremony in Madison Square Garden. 35,000 cops, and the top recruits were being celebrated. So the first was someone with an Anglo-Saxon name. He was the valedictorian. But the number 2 person that year was a short Bangladeshi cop named Muhammad Islam. And so he stands up on the podium, and the NYPD marching band, which is all Irish bagpipers, starts slowly going towards the podium, and Muhammad Islam is standing there saluting as the Irish bagpipers are serenading him.
So,
And I thought, this is New York. This is the possibilities, this. And so with all of these educational institutions, whether it's NYPD or NYU or whatever, the thing that creates empathy is literature, as you pointed out, and proximity to immigrants.
we need to wind
If you follow Brexit, the people that actually voted to leave in Britain, the people who were, and let's not kid ourselves, Brexit's not about the economy, it's about fear of immigrants. But the people who voted to leave were in the whitest section of Great Britain. They were the people who knew immigrants least, and places like London voted to stay because they knew this everyday conversation, this everyday discourse with people who are different from you makes for a much better city, a much better country, and a richer country, a nicer country, a more intelligent country, a more creative country.
Thank you. So in the interest of giving time to everybody to speak to the authors, I'm now going to open it up for questions. We have 7 or 8 minutes. If you would stand up, and preferably not a comment so we can get more people in. You can tell me who the question is for, and then we can be efficient about it. So do you have any questions?
It's not a question, and you said don't make
Well,
comments.
quick comment is fine,
But
ma'am.
I love the panel, but they're all from liberal states. I wonder if we had somebody from, I don't want to name a state, but we all know what we're saying, what they would say.
Well,
Because it's a conversation.
I was hoping there would be people in the audience, so it looks like they don't
Oh, I
want to
hope
be
there
here.
is.
Yeah, Texas is not that way.
This is for Andrew. You mentioned that you did
Ronald Reagan came from California, and what's his name? Who's the senator? Ted Cruz is from Texas. So just.
Ready for a question?
Hi, this is for Andrew. You mentioned the short film about the boat people. Where can you see that?
I think you can go on Al Jazeera and look for boat people remembering boat people. It's just like a very short segment, but it's very powerful because it invokes this sense of sympathy for people who don't share any kind of history but understand exactly the plight of homelessness and fear.
We can type your name as well, so it should show.
Yeah, I think you can. Yeah, Andrew Lamb.
All right, questions at the back, sir? Yes?
Thank you. The question for Dr. Scott. You mentioned briefly, which was very significant, that you said about Indians, but I mean, Indian community doing very well and some other communities doing well. Is there some genetic or psychological commonness for the whole community? I mean, can you typify a community with certain traits? I mean, just because I'm Indian, am I similar in everything to another
certainly
1 billion people?
Certainly not genetic, okay, by any stretch of the imagination. But we're going to talk a lot about this tomorrow, but very, very briefly, there's a lot of mentoring that goes on in the Indian American community. There's a lot of recognition of hierarchy. There's a real understanding. Indians came here, unlike many other minorities, except perhaps, say, than the Irish. They came here speaking English. That was, many people did. That's huge. We also were blessed to have Indians coming here in the mid-60s who were highly educated and created an infrastructure for subsequent generations. So there were some certain common factors, but for sure it's not genetic. But
Hi. So this question is for any of you. I'm first generation, and I remember when I was a little girl, the whole thrust was become American. Don't be different, assimilate. I mean, that was just huge in our family. And don't do anything that'll make you stand out as different. And it seems very, very the opposite now. Is that true?
I can take that. Yes,
It's
this is what I've been writing about in my new book. There's entire neighborhoods in New York where you can live, work, love, find a job speaking only Bengali or Italian or Urdu or Spanish, and I think it's a positive sign, mostly, that you don't have to melt into any kind of pot. You don't have to be Americanized. You can be Indian or Mexican or Vietnamese or Jamaican. And I think what's changed is that now, in the early 20th century, in the 19th century, the immigrants who came here, they came in a boat. They might be able to go back once in their lifetimes back to the old country. Now, with a round trip home, it's $500 or $1,000. What is exile anymore? So people go back and forth, immigrants, regularly to refresh their roots and live in cities like New York, like Los Angeles, I imagine even like Boulder, without having to be this kind of homogeneous American. You can eat your own food, dress in your own clothes, educate your children in their language. But then the challenge then is, of course, what does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be New Yorker? How do we forge a national identity with this wonderful, crazy quilt of ethnicities?
So I would like to add a comment here, which is that yes, on one hand, it was an attitude about what it is to be American, which has become part of that melting pot, would then change to be being part of that salad bowl and look like the tomatoes and look like the cucumbers that you really are and be in those neighborhoods. I think it's also to do when it comes to being an immigrant from, say, South Asia or a developing country. It's also that many of those countries by now have done very well. So the immigrants who are here are not as much on the defensive about saying, I'm from India, where people ride camels and live in whatever. So I think there is a certain pride that also goes with what's happening in the back home, which is not their home. And so there is a greater pride in just going beyond the ethnic. It's also a political thing. And we saw some of that in, for example, in the way that Prime Minister Modi was received in this country on several visits in the last 1 year. And it was political, it was social. There are areas in the Indian American community that offer a dissent to that. But the fact that many immigrants then can identify with something that they don't have to be embarrassed about. I think that's also been the passage of the last 30 years or so for some countries.
I think we have time for one more.
All right, so you choose the one more, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I would like to explain a little bit about the psyche of immigrants. And that
Ma'am, we have 3 minutes, if you can do that.
most of the immigrants here, I think, have achieved the American dreams and are very proud of that. But deep inside, I think there's a feeling of guilt, of abandoning their culture to be integrated into the American atmosphere. What comes into my mind is the so-called terrorists, or maybe you can call them terrorists, and that I would ask, they are more or less integrated into the American society, but why is it they turn against America, like in the Boston terrorist or in the New Jersey terrorist that we just experienced a few days ago? And if I can somehow get an insight in that, they were integrated, but they felt guilty, defensive about their own culture, and therefore they take this action. And I would like our psychologists to some kind of address that question.
I have a very peculiar view of this. So here's my peculiar view of it. My peculiar view of it is that it's not a psychological issue, but it's an issue of gun control. And for me, the issue is, I think when we look into the motivations behind people who murder other people, we'll find all sorts of reasons. But the danger that I feel is we're not really addressing the NRA's control of the political dialogue. So quite frankly, it's not an issue for a psychologist, it's an issue for someone with civic authority to shut it down. I have no issue with somebody I travel a lot to Japan, and in Japan they have a really good set of gun laws, so I don't have a problem with people owning guns. The issue is how the access to these weapons, that's the issue, whether the person's guilty about their culture, psychotic, depressed. We're always going to have guilty, psychotic, depressed people, but if we have gun control, this won't happen.
Thank you very much on that note.
So we had a lively set of opinions here and differences, which is the way it should be in a panel. I don't think we should stereotype and think that there's one kind of person that becomes a terrorist, or there's one kind of immigrant who always throws away their ethnic heritage. I think there's space here for a lot of disagreement. That's what we like to encourage. Thank you so much.